The first luxury cabin started sliding at 11:43 on a Tuesday morning. 32 homeowners were standing on the overlook when it happened. Most of them were holding phones. Some were filming, while others were arguing about what they were seeing. A few were still insisting the building was not moving at all. I was not one of them. 6 months earlier, I had told Vanessa Whitmore exactly what would happen if she built luxury cabins beside my flood channel. She smiled, thanked me for my concern, and then ignored every word I said. Now $500,000 of real estate was slowly sinking into the ground while she stood 20 feet away watching it happen. The storm had started before sunrise. By mid-morning, the rain had become relentless. Water poured down the hillsides in sheets, drainage ditches overflowed, and every low spot in the valley looked like a pond. Meanwhile, the flood channel crossing my property was doing exactly what it had done for decades. Its job. The crowd gathered along the ridge overlooked the new cabin development below. 3 luxury cabins sat near the valley floor. They were supposed to be the centerpiece of the Homeowners Association's newest project. Weekend rentals, corporate retreats, and nature getaways. Vanessa had spent months promoting them through brochures, online listings, and community presentations. According to her, they would transform the subdivision into a destination. According to me, they were sitting in the worst possible location. The rain intensified. I watched muddy water surge through the channel below. The current was not overflowing yet, and that was the important part. Most people assume flooding only became dangerous when water spilled over the banks. That was not true. The real danger started when moving water began taking soil with it. And that is exactly what was happening beneath the first cabin. The ground supporting one corner of the structure was disappearing. Slowly. Steadily. One chunk at a time. A man standing near the railing suddenly pointed toward the cabin. Several heads turned, and the crowd fell quiet. Everyone stared at the same spot. The cabin shifted. Not much. Maybe an inch. But it moved. A nervous murmur spread through the homeowners. Phones immediately lifted higher. People started recording. Someone laughed nervously. Someone else swore under his breath. I kept my eyes on the foundation. The movement was not random. The soil underneath was failing, and once that process started, it rarely stopped on its own. Vanessa stepped forward through the crowd. Even from a distance, she carried herself the same way she always had. Confident. Composed. Certain. She raised her voice. Everyone needs to relax. Nobody looked relaxed. The engineers designed these cabins for weather conditions. The crowd wanted reassurance. The problem was that the cabin did not care about reassurance. It cared about physics, and physics was winning. Another section of bank collapsed into the channel. The water swallowed it instantly. A few people gasped. The cabin shifted again, and this time nobody argued about what they had seen. Vanessa stopped talking. For the first time all morning, her attention stayed fixed on the structure. I wondered if she finally understood. Not because I wanted to be right, but because being right meant this disaster was only beginning. The rain kept falling. Water raced through the channel. The crowd grew larger as more vehicles arrived and more homeowners gathered along the ridge. Questions started spreading faster than answers. Is it safe? Can it be stabilized? Should not somebody do something? Nobody seemed to know. The cabin leaned slightly toward the channel, just enough to make people uncomfortable. Then a sharp, cracking sound echoed across the valley. Everyone heard it. Conversations stopped instantly. The sound came from beneath the structure. One of the support sections had failed. The cabin dropped several inches. A woman screamed. Several people backed away from the railing. One man lowered his phone and simply stared. Vanessa looked frozen. Not panicked. Not yet. Just stunned, as if reality had suddenly stopped following the script she expected. I looked from the cabin to the flood channel below, then back to Vanessa. Despite everything happening around me, I found myself thinking about our first conversation. The day I walked over to introduce myself. The day I saw survey stakes near the channel. The day Vanessa Whitmore explained her plans for luxury cabins. And the day I warned her exactly what would happen if she built them there. She did not argue. She did not get angry. She laughed. Construction started anyway. 6 months earlier, the valley looked completely different. The flood channel was little more than a dry ribbon of gravel cutting through the lower end of my property. Wild grass grew along the banks. A few scattered cottonwood trees provided shade. Unless you knew what happened during storm season, it looked harmless. That was why most people underestimated it. I was driving the eastern boundary of my land one afternoon when I noticed something that had not been there the week before. Survey stakes. Bright orange. Dozens of them. They ran along the edge of the valley and continued toward the flood channel. I stopped my truck and walked over for a closer look. The moment I saw where the stakes were placed, I felt a knot form in my stomach. Somebody was planning to build near the channel, very near. I followed the line of stakes for several hundred feet. The farther I walked, the worse it looked. Whoever designed the layout seemed more interested in maximizing views than understanding the land. At the time, I did not know who was behind it. That answer arrived 2 days later. A large community meeting was held at the subdivision clubhouse. Flyers had been posted all over the neighborhood announcing an exciting new development project. Since the construction bordered my property, I decided to attend. The clubhouse was packed. Homeowners filled nearly every chair. Large presentation boards stood near the front of the room. Architectural renderings showed beautiful cabins overlooking the valley. Walking trails connected the structures to common areas. Everything looked polished, expensive, and carefully marketed. Then Vanessa Whitmore stepped onto the stage. The room immediately quieted. She carried herself like someone completely comfortable being the center of attention. Confident smile. Expensive clothes. Perfectly prepared presentation. For the next 20 minutes she described her vision for the community. According to Vanessa, the subdivision had untapped potential. The cabins would generate revenue. Property values would increase. The neighborhood would become a destination rather than just another collection of homes. The audience loved it. People nodded. People applauded. Some homeowners were already discussing future rental income before the presentation even ended. Then Vanessa revealed the site map. The moment it appeared on the screen, my attention locked onto one specific area: the valley, the flood channel, the cabins. My concerns instantly became much more serious. When the meeting ended, a crowd gathered around Vanessa. Homeowners congratulated her. Board members smiled for photos. Everyone seemed excited. I waited until most of the crowd dispersed. Then I walked over. "Vanessa?" I asked. She turned and smiled. "Yes?" I introduced myself and explained that the flood channel crossed my property. The smile remained. At first. Then I pointed toward the development map, specifically toward the cabins. Her expression changed slightly. Not concern, more like impatience. "I think you may have a problem with those locations," I said. She folded her arms. "What kind of problem?" "The flood channel." "We have reviewed that." I nodded. "I am sure somebody reviewed it. The question is whether they understood it." That answer clearly irritated her. "The project has engineers," she said. "I am not questioning that." "Then what are you questioning?" I looked at the site map again. "The channel does not overflow every year. That is why people get comfortable around it. But when it does, it follows very specific paths. Some of those cabins appear to be sitting directly beside one of them." Vanessa gave a small laugh. Not a nervous laugh. A dismissive one. "The county reviewed everything. That does not mean the land changed." Her smile tightened. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then she leaned slightly closer. "Mr. Holloway, I appreciate your concern, but we are not building these cabins based on guesswork." I was not offended. I was worried. Because people who truly understood risk usually ask questions. Vanessa was not asking any. She had already decided she was right. "The flood channel has been there longer than any of us," I said. "Water remembers where it is supposed to go." She shook her head. "I think we will trust the professionals." That conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but I remember walking back to my truck feeling uneasy. Not because we disagreed. Disagreements happen. What bothered me was how quickly she dismissed the possibility that she might be wrong. Over the following weeks, construction equipment began arriving. Excavators, bulldozers, dump trucks. Every time I passed the site, the project grew larger. And every time I looked at those cabin locations, the same thought kept returning. They were building in exactly the wrong place. Then one morning I noticed something that turned concern into alarm. The excavation crews were not simply building near the flood channel. They were changing the land around it. And that was a very different problem. The excavation crews arrived less than 2 weeks after my conversation with Vanessa. At first, the activity looked routine. Trucks delivered materials. Equipment operators marked boundaries. Temporary fencing appeared around sections of the property. From a distance, it looked like every other construction project I had seen over the years. But the closer I looked, the less comfortable I became. One afternoon, I parked near the edge of my property and watched a bulldozer working along the valley floor. The operator was not preparing cabin pads. He was moving large amounts of earth near the flood channel itself. That immediately got my attention. The flood channel was not the real protection system. Most people never understood that. The real protection was the surrounding landscape. Small depressions, natural slopes, overflow areas, features that had developed over decades and quietly directed water where it needed to go during heavy storms. One of those features sat directly beside the proposed cabin sites. A shallow basin. Nothing dramatic. Most of the year it looked completely unimportant. But during major rain events, water spread into that basin before re-entering the channel farther downstream. It slowed the current and reduced erosion. I had seen it happen multiple times. Now excavation equipment was tearing through it. The next morning I returned. The basin was already half gone. Fresh dirt covered areas that had previously been untouched. Survey flags marked future construction zones. Workers moved efficiently from one task to another, unaware they were removing one of the most important drainage features in the valley. I took several photos with my phone. Then several more. A bad feeling was beginning to grow. 3 days later it got worse. The basin was completely gone. In its place sat a broad section of flattened ground extending toward the future cabin sites. The change was impossible to miss. Anyone comparing old aerial photographs to the current site would immediately see it. That afternoon I drove to the subdivision office. Vanessa happened to be there. When she saw me walk in, her expression suggested she already knew why I had come. "Grant," she said, "what can I do for you?" I placed several printed photographs on the desk. The smile faded. She glanced at the images, then back at me. "What is this?" "The overflow basin." She studied the photographs again. "I do not know what you mean." "Yes, you do." I pointed toward the images. "That depression handled excess flow during storms. Your contractors just removed it." Vanessa barely looked at the photographs a second time. "Our engineers reviewed the drainage plan." That was not my question. Our engineers approved everything. I had already noticed a pattern. Every concern received the same answer. Engineers approved it. Engineers reviewed it. Engineers signed off on it. As though repeating the phrase enough times made the laws of nature irrelevant. "The land does not care who approved the paperwork," I said. Her patience was beginning to disappear. "And I am telling you the project meets requirements." I pointed toward the photos again. Then somebody made a mistake. That statement finally irritated her. For the first time, the conversation lost its polite tone. "Grant, with all due respect, you are not part of this project." "No, but the flood channel crosses my property. And we have complied with every regulation." "You keep talking about regulations." "Because they matter." I nodded. "They do. But water does not read regulations." For a second, neither of us spoke. Then Vanessa leaned back in her chair. "You have made your concerns clear." The meeting was over, at least from her perspective. I gathered the photographs and left. Outside, construction equipment continued operating in the distance. The project moved forward exactly as planned. Over the next month, the pace accelerated. Excavators reshaped the valley floor. New access roads appeared. Utility trenches were dug. Concrete trucks arrived. Foundations were poured. With each passing week, the cabins became more real. And my concerns became harder to ignore. The worst part was not the cabin locations anymore. It was the confidence. Nobody involved seemed worried. Nobody paused to reconsider. Nobody asked whether changing the landscape might create consequences later. Every question was answered with the same phrase. The engineers approved it. One evening, I stood on a ridge overlooking the construction site. The future cabins were clearly visible now. For the first time, I stopped thinking about whether the project might fail. Instead, I started wondering how expensive the failure would be. That was the moment my approach changed. Up until then, I had relied on conversations, warnings, common sense. From that day forward, I decided to rely on evidence. I went home, created a dedicated folder on my computer, and began organizing every photograph I had taken. Dates, locations, construction changes, everything. If nobody wanted to listen now, that was their choice. But from that point on, I intended to document every single step they took. Once I started documenting the project, I noticed something strange almost immediately. The construction site and the approved drawings did not seem to match. At first, I assumed I was missing something. Large projects often change during construction. Minor adjustments happened all the time. Utility locations shifted, access roads moved, drainage features were refined. But the differences I was seeing were not minor. They were significant. A few days after organizing my photos, I visited the county planning office and requested copies of the public site plans. The documents were not difficult to obtain. Since the project had already received approval, most of the paperwork was publicly accessible. I spent the next several hours reviewing every page. Then, I reviewed them again. The approved drawings clearly showed a drainage corridor running along one side of the cabin development. According to the plans, stormwater was supposed to be directed away from the structures before re-entering the natural channel farther downstream. That seemed reasonable. The problem was that the drainage corridor did not exist. At least not on the actual construction site. The next morning, I returned to the valley with copies of the plans. I walked the entire area. Twice. The corridor shown on paper was not there. Instead, the ground had been flattened. The elevation changes were different. Several drainage features shown on the drawings appeared to have disappeared completely. I stood there comparing the plans to the landscape in front of me. Nothing lined up. The more measurements I took, the stranger it became. One cabin pad extended farther toward the flood channel than shown on the approved documents. Another appeared to sit several feet outside its original location. Retaining features displayed on the plans had either been reduced or removed entirely. Individually, none of the differences seemed dramatic. Together, they painted a very different picture. That evening, I spread the documents across my dining room table. Photographs sat beside engineering drawings. Notes covered several pages. Measurements filled the margins. I was not looking for problems anymore. The problems were finding me. One particular detail kept drawing my attention. A drainage swale. The approved plans clearly showed it. It was not large, but it served an important purpose. During heavy storms, excess runoff would be redirected away from the cabins before reaching the flood channel. Simple, effective, necessary, and completely absent from the construction site. I checked the plans again. Then again, the swale was definitely there. The construction definitely was not. By the end of the week, I had identified several similar inconsistencies. Missing drainage protections, modified grading, relocated construction boundaries, changed elevations. None of them made sense. Projects usually became safer during construction, not riskier. Yet every difference seemed to increase exposure to flooding. That was not normal. One afternoon, I met Derek Lawson for coffee and showed him the documents. He studied the plans for several minutes before looking up. So either the builders ignored the drawings, he said, or these are not the drawings they used. That possibility had not occurred to me. I sat back in my chair. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I looked down at the plans again. If Derek was right, it explained everything. The missing protections, the altered grading, the disappearing drainage features. Maybe the construction was not drifting away from the approved design. Maybe someone had changed the design after approval. The thought stayed with me all the way home. That night, I reviewed every document one more time. The more I looked, the more questions appeared. Who changed the plans? When were they changed? And most importantly, who authorized the changes? By then, simple observation was not enough. Photographs could only tell part of the story. The answers were buried somewhere in the paperwork. So the next morning, I sat down at my computer and prepared formal requests for every project record I could legally obtain. If something did not match, I intended to find out why. While I was digging through records and comparing plans, the HOA was doing something very different. They were selling a dream. The first advertisements appeared online near the end of summer. Professionally designed images showed luxury cabins overlooking the valley. Families sat around fire pits. Couples drank coffee on covered porches. Sunset views stretched across perfectly landscaped scenery. The marketing made it look like a private mountain resort. There was just one problem. Most of it did not exist yet. The cabins were still under construction. The landscaping was not finished. The trails were not complete. And the flood risks certainly were not mentioned. That did not stop reservations from pouring in. Within weeks, the HOA website proudly announced that multiple weekends had already sold out. Social media pages celebrated the demand. Homeowners shared posts with friends and family. Every new booking seemed to generate even more excitement. The project was becoming exactly what Vanessa promised. Or at least that is what everyone believed. One Saturday afternoon, I attended another community meeting. The atmosphere felt completely different from the first one. Back then, people had questions. Now they had confidence. The clubhouse was filled with optimism. Homeowners talked about increased property values. Some discussed future expansion. Others suggested adding more cabins if the first phase succeeded. Everywhere I looked, people were congratulating Vanessa. She accepted the praise comfortably. The project had become her biggest success story. A large presentation board near the front of the room displayed projected revenue numbers. According to the estimates, the cabins would generate substantial income for the HOA within the first few years. The audience loved it. Applause broke out several times during the presentation. I sat quietly near the back, listening, watching, trying to understand how nobody else seemed concerned. When the meeting opened for questions, I raised my hand. The room immediately became less enthusiastic. A few people recognized me. Others remembered my earlier concerns. Vanessa noticed too. Her smile tightened slightly. "Yes, Grant?" I stood. "Have the drainage modifications been reviewed since construction began?" The room grew quiet. Not hostile. Just uncomfortable. Vanessa answered without hesitation. "Everything remains fully compliant." "That is not what I asked." A few people shifted in their seats. Vanessa kept smiling. "The project has been reviewed by qualified professionals." There it was again. The same answer. The same shield. The same refusal to address the actual concern. One homeowner near the front turned around and looked at me. "Are you saying the cabins are not safe?" Before I could answer, Vanessa stepped in. "What he is saying is that he disagrees with the experts." A few people nodded. Some even laughed. The conversation moved on. But something changed after that meeting. I started noticing it everywhere. People stopped asking for my opinion. Neighbors who used to chat about the project now avoided the topic. Some clearly viewed me as the guy trying to ruin a successful community investment. The more popular the cabins became, the more isolated I felt. Meanwhile, Vanessa's confidence continued growing. New reservations were announced. Construction milestones were celebrated. Promotional signs appeared near the entrance of the subdivision. Every success seemed to reinforce her belief that the project was untouchable. But confidence and reality are not always the same thing. One evening, while reviewing weather data online, I noticed something that immediately caught my attention. Several long-range forecasts were beginning to agree. The upcoming wet season could be significantly heavier than normal. At first, I dismissed it. Seasonal forecasts were not perfect. But over the following weeks, the predictions became more consistent. Higher rainfall totals, increased storm activity, greater flood potential across the region. For most people, it was just another weather report. For me, it felt like a countdown. Because if the forecasts were right, the flood channel would soon face its biggest test in years. And so would Vanessa's cabins. The first batch of records arrived 3 weeks after I submitted my requests. Most people imagine investigations as dramatic moments. A hidden file appears. A whistleblower steps forward. One document changes everything. Real investigations are not like that. Most of the time, they are boring. Hundreds of pages, technical drawings, meeting minutes, engineering notes, permit applications, hours of reading just to find a few details that actually matter. I spent several evenings going through the documents one page at a time. At first, nothing jumped out. Then I started building timelines. That was when things became interesting. The permit application included several conditions that had been attached during the approval process. Some of them were routine: erosion controls, construction access requirements, environmental protections. Others were much more important. One condition specifically addressed stormwater management near the flood channel. Another referenced drainage controls designed to protect structures during unusually heavy rainfall. I highlighted both. Then I compared those conditions against the construction photographs I had taken. The match was not good. Several of the protections mentioned in the permit either appeared incomplete or completely absent. That alone was not proof of wrongdoing. Projects sometimes implemented requirements later in construction. But it was enough to make me keep digging. A second packet of documents arrived the following week. This one contained engineering revisions. The moment I opened the file, I noticed something strange. The drainage drawings looked different, not dramatically different. Subtly different. The kind of difference most people would never notice. But after weeks of studying the project, I noticed immediately. Certain features shown in earlier versions were gone. A protective drainage swale had disappeared. Several grading notes had changed. Runoff pathways looked simplified. The more pages I reviewed, the more uncomfortable I became. I laid multiple versions side by side across my dining room table. One drawing. Then another. Then another. Then another. The differences slowly revealed themselves. The original design appeared to direct excess water away from the cabins. The later versions did less of that. Some protections had been reduced. Others seemed to vanish entirely. I spent the next 2 days verifying everything. Checking dates. Comparing revisions. Cross-referencing notes. By Friday evening, I was convinced of one thing. The project had not been built exactly as originally designed. Something had changed along the way. The question was why. The answer arrived inside a set of board meeting records. Buried deep within several pages of routine discussion was a short section about project costs. Nothing dramatic. No confession. No smoking gun. Just a conversation about budgets, material expenses, construction schedules, cost reductions. But one sentence caught my attention. A consultant had recommended maintaining several drainage features because they provided additional protection during severe weather events. The recommendation was noted, then ignored. The board chose a different approach, a cheaper approach. I read the passage 3 times, then a fourth. The recommendation was not legally binding, but it existed. Someone had raised concerns, someone had identified potential risks, and somebody decided those protections were not necessary. For the first time, I stopped viewing the cabins as a construction problem. I started viewing them as a liability problem. There is a difference. A construction problem costs money. A liability problem destroys budgets. If severe flooding ever damaged those cabins, the questions would not stop at the weather. People would ask who approved the locations, who removed the protections, who ignored the recommendations, and who accepted the risk. Those questions could become very expensive. A few days later, I called Derek and showed him what I had found. He spent nearly an hour reviewing the documents. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "Grant, if this goes bad, it is going to go really bad." I already knew that. The troubling part was how many people still seemed completely unaware. Construction continued. Reservations increased. Vanessa celebrated new milestones. Meanwhile, every document I uncovered pointed toward the same conclusion. The margin for error was shrinking. Then the weather forecasts changed again. Meteorologists began discussing a developing weather pattern capable of producing above-average rainfall throughout the region. What had started as seasonal speculation was becoming something more serious. Storm systems were forming earlier. Rainfall projections were increasing. And for the first time, several forecasts began using the same word. Significant. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, because if those forecasts proved accurate, the flood channel would soon test every decision Vanessa's project had made. And nature rarely offers second chances. The rain started on a Thursday morning. Nothing dramatic at first. Just a steady grey sky and a light drizzle moving across the valley. Most people barely paid attention to it. The weather forecast had predicted several days of rain, but forecasts did not always become reality. By lunchtime, however, it was obvious this storm was different. The rain intensified. Water collected along roadsides. Gutters filled. Small drainage ditches that normally stayed dry throughout the year began carrying a constant flow. I drove down to the flood channel shortly after noon. The first thing I noticed was the speed. Not the depth. The speed. Water was moving through the channel much faster than I expected for such an early stage of the storm. That got my attention. I parked near one of my usual observation points and spent nearly an hour watching conditions develop. The channel remained within its banks, but it was rising. And it was rising quickly. Every piece of debris entering the water disappeared downstream almost immediately. Branches, leaves, and small logs moved through the current like they weighed nothing. The system was responding aggressively. That was not normal. I pulled out my phone and checked the rainfall totals. Then I checked them again. The numbers were not extraordinary. Yet the channel was behaving as if far more water had already entered the watershed. Something was not adding up. Late that afternoon, my phone rang. It was Derek. "Where are you?" he asked. "At the channel." There was a pause. Then he said something that immediately tightened the knot already forming in my stomach. "You need to look at the north drainage." I got there 20 minutes later. Derek was waiting beside a culvert feeding into the upper section of the watershed. The water flowing through it looked wrong. Not dangerous. Wrong. I stood beside him for several minutes before speaking. "You are seeing it too." He nodded. The runoff pattern had changed. Areas that normally absorbed rainfall were shedding water almost immediately. Instead of spreading across the landscape, runoff was concentrating into narrow channels and moving downstream faster than it should. The exact kind of behavior that happened when natural drainage systems were altered. Neither of us needed to say what we were both thinking. The construction site, the grading, the missing drainage protections, the removed overflow basin. Water was already responding to those changes, and the storm had barely begun. By Friday morning, the situation became harder to ignore. The rain continued overnight and showed no signs of stopping. Weather alerts started appearing across local news stations. Meteorologists discussed training storm cells and unusually high moisture levels moving into the region. For the first time, people inside the subdivision started paying attention. Homeowners gathered near the overlook. Construction crews slowed operations. Questions started spreading. How much rain was expected? How high could the water rise? Would the cabins be affected? The confidence that had defined the project for months was beginning to crack. I noticed something else too. Vanessa was suddenly visiting the site much more often. During the previous months, she mostly appeared for celebrations, inspections, and presentations. Now she seemed to be checking conditions personally. Several times I saw her standing near the cabin staring toward the flood channel, watching, calculating, trying to determine whether she had anything to worry about. By midday Friday, the answer was becoming obvious. Yes, the channel had risen several more feet. The current was now carrying large branches and entire sections of vegetation downstream. Erosion scars began appearing along parts of the bank. Areas that had remained stable for years suddenly looked vulnerable. I spent most of the afternoon moving between observation points. Everywhere I looked, the same pattern appeared. More water, more speed, more pressure. Then, shortly before 3 o'clock, Derek called again. This time, he did not waste a second. "Grant," he said, "you better get down here." I immediately turned my truck around. When I arrived, several homeowners were already gathered near the first cabin. Nobody was talking much. Most were simply staring. I followed their gaze. Then I saw it. For the first time since construction began, floodwater had reached the edge of the cabin property. And it was still rising. The moment people saw water reach the cabin property, the mood changed. For months, the project had been surrounded by optimism. Every meeting had focused on growth, revenue, and future expansion. Homeowners talked about bookings and property values. Nobody wanted to discuss flood risks. Now floodwater was sitting less than 100 feet from the nearest structure, and everyone could see it. Small groups formed around the overlook. Conversations became quieter and more urgent. Phones came out. People took photos and sent messages. Some homeowners began calling neighbors who were not at the site. The excitement that had fueled the project was being replaced by uncertainty. I walked toward the gathering crowd and listened. Has it ever gotten this high before? Should not somebody be checking the foundations? Are the cabins insured for this? Nobody seemed to have clear answers. Then Vanessa arrived. The effect was immediate. People turned toward her the same way passengers look toward a pilot during turbulence. They wanted confidence. They wanted certainty. Most of all, they wanted someone to tell them everything was going to be fine. Vanessa seemed more than willing to do exactly that. She stepped onto a small rise overlooking the cabins and addressed the crowd. Everyone needs to stay calm. The words sounded familiar. I had heard some version of them every time concerns were raised. The drainage system is functioning exactly as intended. Several homeowners visibly relaxed. Others looked less convinced. One man pointed toward the water. Then why is it already that close? Vanessa did not hesitate. Because we are experiencing heavy rainfall. That is what drainage systems are designed for. The answer sounded reasonable. Until you actually looked at the channel. The water was not stabilizing. It was still climbing. A woman near the front folded her arms. Should we move equipment away from the cabins? Vanessa shook her head. There is no reason to overreact. Another homeowner asked whether temporary barriers should be installed. Vanessa rejected that idea too. According to her, the engineering plans had anticipated severe weather. The site was performing as designed. There was no reason to create unnecessary alarm. Several people accepted the explanation. Others did not. The uncertainty remained. About an hour later, a county employee arrived to inspect conditions. He spent several minutes studying the channel before speaking with a few residents. I could not hear the entire conversation, but I did hear one recommendation: prepare for the possibility of evacuation if conditions worsen. It was not an order, just a precaution. A reasonable one. Vanessa rejected it almost immediately. There is no need for that, she said. The employee did not argue. He simply documented conditions and moved on. That bothered me more than I expected, not because an evacuation was necessary yet, because Vanessa seemed incapable of acknowledging even the possibility that something might be wrong. Every new piece of information passed through the same filter. If it supported the project, she embraced it. If it raised concerns, she dismissed it. By late afternoon, the rain intensified again. The crowd slowly thinned as people returned home, but I stayed near the channel. Something kept bothering me. The water level was rising exactly the way I expected, but the flow pattern was not. I grabbed my binoculars and studied the valley floor. For several minutes I could not identify what felt wrong. Then I saw it. A narrow stream of water had broken away from the main channel. It was not large. Not yet. But it was moving toward a section of ground that should have remained dry. My stomach tightened immediately, because I recognized that route. I had seen water follow it before, years ago. Long before the cabins existed. Long before the grading changes. Long before the overflow basin disappeared. I lowered the binoculars and looked again. The stream was growing wider, and for the first time since the storm began, I realized the channel was not the biggest threat anymore. The water was starting to find its old way home. The first person to notice the change was not an engineer. It was not a county official. It was not Vanessa. It was an elderly homeowner standing beside the overlook. He pointed toward the valley floor and said 3 simple words. That was not there. Everyone followed his finger. The narrow stream I had spotted earlier was no longer narrow. Over the past hour, it had widened into a fast-moving channel of muddy water cutting across the construction site. The crowd watched in silence. Most of them did not understand what they were seeing. I did. The floodwater was not creating a new route, it was rediscovering an old one. For decades, excess water had spread into the natural overflow basin before slowly returning to the main channel. The basin absorbed energy, reduced erosion, and protected the surrounding land from concentrated flow. Then the HOA removed it. The land never forgot it existed. And now the water was trying to rebuild it. One storm, one afternoon, and years of natural drainage patterns were beginning to reappear. The stream widened again. Fresh sections of soil collapsed into the moving water. Small gullies formed where none had existed just days earlier. The current carved deeper into the valley floor with every passing minute. Several homeowners moved closer to the edge for a better view. I moved the opposite direction. I knew what accelerated erosion looked like. And this was accelerating fast. By late afternoon, the water had cut a visible path through the area where the overflow basin once sat. The channel was not overflowing. That was the frightening part. Everything happening was occurring before the main channel even reached its limits. Nature was correcting the landscape while still operating below maximum capacity. A construction supervisor arrived shortly afterward. He walked the site with several workers and spoke into a radio repeatedly. Their body language told the story before their words did. Something had gone wrong. Equipment started moving. Temporary barriers appeared. Workers attempted to redirect runoff using piles of gravel and soil. The effort lasted less than an hour. The water ignored every bit of it. I watched one temporary berm disappear in less than 5 minutes. The current simply flowed around it, then through it, then over it, then over it. By early evening, first visible damage appeared. A section of ground beneath a cabin access path gave way. Part of the gravel road collapsed into the newly forming drainage route. People immediately noticed. Several phones came out. Photos spread through neighborhood group chats. Panic began moving faster than the floodwater. Calls started reaching the HOA office. Then the county. Then emergency services. Not because lives were in danger. Not yet. Because property owners wanted answers. Nobody seemed capable of providing them. Vanessa remained at the site. To her credit, she was not hiding. She walked from group to group speaking with residents and trying to maintain order. But the confidence she had displayed all year was beginning to crack. Every time someone asked whether conditions were under control, her answers became shorter, less certain, more defensive. Meanwhile, the water kept advancing. The old overflow route grew wider. The valley floor continued changing shape. And the flood basin the construction crews had erased was slowly trying to exist again. I stood beside Derek watching it happen. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. There was not much left to say. The evidence was flowing right in front of us. Then Derek pointed toward the nearest cabin. At first I did not see anything unusual. Then I noticed the support posts. One side of the structure appeared lower than the other. Only slightly, but enough to catch my attention. I grabbed my binoculars. The ground beneath part of the foundation had been eaten away. Not completely. Not yet. But enough that the supports were no longer carrying weight evenly. A homeowner nearby noticed it too. Then another. Within moments, dozens of people were staring at the same spot. The crowd fell silent. Nobody needed an engineer to explain what they were seeing. The structure was moving. Slowly. Almost imperceptibly. But moving. A sharp cracking sound echoed across the valley. Several people jumped. One support post shifted sideways. The cabin tilted. Just a few inches. But that was enough. Because once the movement started, everyone understood the same thing at the same time. The floodwater had reached the foundations. And one of Vanessa Whitmore's luxury cabins had just shifted off its supports. The moment the first cabin shifted, the situation stopped being a construction problem. It became an emergency. Within 30 minutes, emergency vehicles began arriving at the subdivision. County personnel parked near the overlook. Public works employees inspected drainage conditions. Sheriff's deputies helped manage traffic as more residents gathered near the site. The atmosphere changed immediately. People who had spent months discussing profits and vacation rentals were now discussing safety. The questions sounded very different. Could the cabin collapse? How close is the water getting? Should people leave? Nobody was talking about reservations anymore. The storm continued through the evening hours. Rain hammered rooftops and roads without slowing. The flood channel carried more debris than I had seen in years. Entire sections of brush disappeared downstream. Trees along the bank leaned dangerously as the current undercut the soil around them. Every hour seemed worse than the one before it. I spent most of that time documenting conditions, photographs, videos, timestamps, water levels, erosion patterns. I recorded everything, not because I expected anyone to thank me later, because I knew people would eventually argue about what happened. Memories change. Photographs do not. As darkness approached, emergency personnel expanded the safety perimeter around the cabins. The first structure remained standing, but nobody trusted it anymore. The foundation had already shifted. Additional erosion continued beneath portions of the support system. Every passing hour increased the risk. Around that time, county officials began speaking directly with residents whose properties sat closest to the developing flood route. The conversations were calm but serious. Prepare to leave if conditions worsen. Have important belongings ready. Be prepared for additional notices. For many homeowners, that was the first moment the reality truly sank in. This was not a temporary inconvenience. The situation was becoming unpredictable. Vanessa hated that word. Predictability had always been her strongest weapon. Every presentation, every meeting, every promise she made depended on the belief that everything was under control. Now control was disappearing. I watched her speaking with county officials several times throughout the afternoon. The conversations appeared increasingly tense. She pointed toward the cabins repeatedly. Officials pointed toward the water. Neither side seemed satisfied. By sunset, frustrated homeowners began demanding answers directly. Some blamed the weather, others blamed contractors. Several openly blamed the HOA board. The pressure continued building. Vanessa tried addressing small groups of residents, but each conversation seemed to create more questions instead of fewer. For the first time since construction began, nobody appeared interested in hearing another reassurance. They wanted explanations. Unfortunately, explanations were becoming difficult to find. Just before dusk, a loud rumble echoed across the valley. Heads turned instantly. A fresh section of bank had collapsed near the second cabin. The erosion was not reaching the structure yet, but it was getting closer, much closer. Emergency personnel moved people farther back from the overlook. Additional barriers were installed. The crowd grew quieter. Everyone was watching the same thing, the water, and the land beneath the cabins. As daylight faded, powerful work lights illuminated portions of the site. Their bright beams revealed fresh damage that had been difficult to see earlier. The developing overflow route had become a full drainage channel. The flood basin was continuing to reform. And the second cabin was no longer sitting on stable ground. I raised my binoculars one more time. The support posts looked wrong. Several appeared exposed. Others leaned slightly. The water was not there yet, but the soil was disappearing. Then a sharp crack echoed through the darkness. Several support beams shifted visibly. A corner of the second cabin dropped. Not inches, feet. Gasps erupted across the overlook. Emergency personnel immediately moved people farther away. And as the structure settled into its failing foundation, everyone realized the disaster was spreading. The first cabin was no longer the only one in trouble. The second cabin had just suffered a major structural failure. By the following morning, the rain had finally stopped. For the first time in nearly 3 days, the valley was quiet. The floodwater was still moving through the channel, but the violent surge that had dominated the landscape was gone. Clouds drifted apart overhead. Patches of sunlight began appearing across the hillsides. The storm had moved on. Its damage had not. I arrived at the site shortly after sunrise. Dozens of people were already there. Some stood silently along the overlook. Others walked the subdivision roads taking photographs. A few simply stared at the valley below as if they could not believe what they were seeing. The view was almost unrecognizable. The newly formed drainage route cut directly through portions of the development. Deep erosion scars crossed areas that had been carefully graded only weeks earlier. Large sections of exposed soil lined the valley floor. The land looked as though it had been reshaped by machinery. Except no machine had done it. Water had. The first cabin remained standing, but barely. One side sat noticeably lower than the other. Several support posts hung partially exposed above empty space where soil once existed. Temporary safety barriers surrounded the structure. The second cabin looked worse. The corner that had dropped during the storm remained visibly tilted. Construction crews had already blocked access to the area. Nobody wanted anyone near it. As more residents arrived, frustration replaced shock. Questions filled the air. Who approved this? Why were not the risks addressed? How could something so expensive fail this quickly? The same conversations repeated throughout the morning. Only the volume changed. Then the photographs started spreading online. At first it was homeowners posting pictures in neighborhood groups. After that came local community pages, then local news outlets. The images practically shared themselves: luxury cabins, flood damage, collapsed foundations, a failed development project. The story had everything people clicked on. By midday, photos from the site were circulating far beyond the subdivision. Some focused on the damaged cabins. Others showed the new drainage channel cutting through the development. A few compared before and after images side by side. Those were the most damaging, because they showed exactly how much the landscape had changed. Vanessa spent most of the morning moving between conversations. Residents stopped her constantly. Some demanded explanations. Others demanded accountability. For the first time since I met her, she no longer seemed to control the discussion. The questions were coming too fast, and there were not enough answers. Around noon, construction supervisors began inspecting the damaged areas more closely. That caught my attention. Not because of the inspections themselves, because of where they focused. Most people were looking at the cabins. The supervisors were not. They kept returning to one specific section near the reforming overflow route. I walked closer. Carefully. The area was muddy, but the receding water had exposed parts of the original grading work. Something immediately stood out. A line of buried material had become visible beneath the eroded soil. At first I assumed it was utility infrastructure. Then I looked again. It was not. It appeared to be part of a drainage system. I followed the exposed section several yards before stopping. My pulse quickened, because I recognized what I was looking at. The construction crews had not simply removed drainage protections. They had buried part of them. The evidence sat exposed in plain sight. A drainage feature that should have remained functional had been covered during grading operations. I stared at it for several seconds. Then I pulled out my phone and started taking photographs. Lots of them. Different angles, different distances, time stamps. Everything. Because if I was seeing this correctly, it explained some of the discrepancies that had bothered me for months. And it suggested the construction changes were far more significant than anyone realized. The photographs got people's attention. The paperwork kept it. Within days of the storm, the county launched a formal review of the project. Engineers visited the site. Inspectors walked the damaged areas. Survey crews took measurements around the cabins and the newly formed drainage route. For the first time since construction began, people were asking the same questions I had been asking for months. What changed? Who approved it? And why? I was not the only one digging anymore. The county wanted answers. The homeowners wanted answers. The insurance companies definitely wanted answers. As the investigation expanded, independent engineering consultants were brought in to review the project. Their job was not to assign blame. Their job was to compare what had been approved against what had actually been built. That distinction mattered. Because opinions can be argued, measurements cannot. Over the next several weeks, documents started moving between agencies, consultants, attorneys, and engineers. Site plans were compared against revision drawings. Construction records were reviewed. Permit conditions were examined line by line. The deeper people looked, the more complicated the project became. Nothing seemed straightforward anymore. One version of a drawing showed certain drainage protections. Another version reduced them. A later version appeared to remove some entirely. Each change came with explanations, cost savings, site adjustments, construction efficiency. On paper, every decision sounded reasonable. The problem was what happened when all those decisions were combined. One small change rarely causes a disaster. 10 small changes can. The independent review team eventually requested aerial photographs taken throughout the construction process. Those images turned out to be extremely important. For months, arguments had centered around engineering theories and competing explanations. The photographs changed that. They showed the landscape itself, month by month, phase by phase. The images confirmed something many people had already suspected. The overflow basin had not simply been altered. It had been largely eliminated. Natural drainage patterns had been reshaped. Protective grading had changed. Runoff pathways had been redirected. The evidence was becoming increasingly difficult to explain away. County officials started attending HOA meetings. That alone made residents nervous. Government representatives rarely appeared when everything was going well. At one meeting, homeowners packed the clubhouse beyond capacity. People stood along walls and filled the rear hallway. Some carried printed photographs. Others brought copies of engineering drawings. Everyone seemed to have questions. Very few people had answers. Vanessa attended every meeting. To her credit, she did not disappear. But her position became harder to defend with each passing week. Every new document generated additional questions. Every new comparison revealed another discrepancy. The investigation seemed to create more uncertainty instead of less. One evening, I sat at my dining room table reviewing another batch of records when something finally connected. Several references kept appearing throughout different documents. Not identical references. Related ones. The same study. The same consultant. The same analysis. Again and again. At first I overlooked it. Then I started tracing the references backward. One report cited another. That report referenced an earlier assessment. That assessment referred to an original review completed before final approval. I spent nearly 2 hours following the paper trail. Eventually, I found what I was looking for, or rather what somebody seemed to have stopped looking at. An early engineering report, not a final report, not a public presentation, an internal technical review. The document was not dramatic. No bold warnings, no alarming language, just professional observations, recommendations, risk assessments. The kind of report most people never read. But one detail immediately stood out. Several drainage concerns discussed in that report never appeared in later versions of the project documentation. I read the relevant pages twice. Then a third time. The concerns were not disproven. They were not resolved. They simply vanished. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the document. Because if I was reading it correctly, this was not just about design changes anymore. Someone had identified potential problems early in the process, and somewhere along the way, those concerns stopped being part of the conversation. The next question was obvious. Who decided to ignore them? The report was not hidden. That was the strange part. Nobody had locked it away. Nobody had deleted it. Nobody had stamped it confidential. It had simply been buried. Hundreds of pages of documents sat between it and the people who should have paid attention to it. And for nearly a year that had been enough. The report had been prepared during the early planning stages of the cabin project. Long before construction started. Long before reservations were sold. Long before homeowners began celebrating future profits. Back when changes could still be made. Back when mistakes could still be avoided. I printed the entire document and spent most of a Saturday reading it. The language was technical. The conclusions were not. One section immediately caught my attention. The consultant had evaluated stormwater behavior within the valley and specifically addressed the natural overflow basin. The same basin that no longer existed. According to the report, the basin provided an important secondary drainage function during high-volume storm events. It reduced flow concentration and limited erosion near future development areas. I read the paragraph twice, then 3 times. The consultant was not guessing. The risk had been identified before the first piece of equipment ever arrived. Several pages later, the report became even more direct. Potential consequences were listed: accelerated erosion, foundation instability, runoff concentration, increased exposure during severe rainfall events. Every major problem that eventually damaged the cabins appeared somewhere in that document. Not predicted perfectly, but recognized. The risks were there. In writing, months before construction began. I highlighted half the report before I finished reading it. Then I started comparing it to later project documents. The differences were impossible to ignore. Entire sections of concern disappeared. Recommendations became optional considerations. Protective features became design alternatives. The warnings did not survive the approval process. By Monday morning, county investigators had obtained their own copy. That changed everything, because now the discussion was not based on opinions anymore. There was a record. A timeline. Evidence. The report showed that flood-related concerns had existed from the beginning. The next question became unavoidable. Who knew? The answer arrived faster than expected. Meeting records revealed that the report had been presented during a board review session months before final approval. Attendance records listed every board member, including Vanessa Whitmore. I was not surprised. A project this large would never move forward without board review. What surprised me was what happened afterward. The meeting summary briefly referenced drainage concerns discussed by the consultant. Then it shifted directly into budget discussions, cost estimates, construction schedules, revenue projections. The flood concerns occupied only a small portion of the meeting. The financial opportunities occupied most of it. The priorities could not have been clearer. As more residents learned about the report, frustration quickly turned into anger. Many homeowners had invested their trust in the project. Some had invested money. Others had defended the cabins whenever concerns were raised. Now they were learning that significant flood risks had been documented long before construction started. The reaction was immediate. Neighborhood groups exploded with discussion. Homeowners shared copies of the report. Highlighted pages circulated online. People began comparing warnings from the report to photographs from the storm damage. The similarities were impossible to miss. One image showed a highlighted paragraph discussing erosion risk. Next to it sat a photograph of the eroded cabin foundation. Another compared drainage recommendations to the damaged valley floor. The evidence practically organized itself. By the end of the week, the report had become the center of every conversation. Residents were not asking whether mistakes had been made anymore. They were asking why nobody listened. And for the first time since the disaster began, the focus shifted away from the weather. The storm was no longer the story. The decisions were. A special HOA meeting was scheduled shortly afterward. Attendance reached record levels. People wanted explanations. People wanted accountability. Most of all, people wanted answers from the individuals who knew about the warnings and moved forward anyway. As homeowners filled the clubhouse that evening, carrying copies of the report in their hands, one thing became painfully clear. The truth was no longer buried. And Vanessa Whitmore was about to discover that everyone else had finally found it too. The emergency HOA meeting started before the room was full. People kept arriving long after it began. Every chair was occupied. Homeowners stood along the walls. Others crowded the hallway outside the clubhouse doors. The atmosphere felt nothing like the enthusiastic meetings that had launched the cabin project months earlier. Back then, people came looking for opportunity. This time, they came looking for accountability. Copies of the engineering report sat on tables throughout the room. Some residents had highlighted entire pages. Others carried folders filled with photographs from the storm. Nobody was interested in presentations. Nobody wanted marketing updates. They wanted answers. Vanessa sat at the front beside the rest of the board. For the first time since I met her, she looked tired. Not defeated. Just tired. The confidence was still there, but it no longer filled the room the way it once had. The meeting opened with a brief statement from the board. It lasted less than 5 minutes before homeowners began interrupting. Questions came from every direction. When did the board learn about the flood risks? Why was not the report shared with residents? Who approved removing the drainage protections? Who signed off on the final plans? The board struggled to keep up. Several members flipped through documents searching for answers. Others avoided eye contact entirely. The pressure kept building. Vanessa eventually stood and addressed the crowd herself. Her voice remained calm. The storm exceeded expectations. The response was immediate. A homeowner near the front raised the engineering report. The report is not about the storm. Several people applauded. Vanessa tried again. Every major project involves risk. That answer landed even worse. The room erupted with frustration. People were not angry because the cabins were damaged. They were angry because they felt misled. The distinction mattered. Most homeowners understood that storms happen. What they did not understand was why documented concerns never became part of the public conversation. For nearly an hour, Vanessa attempted to defend the project. She argued that professionals had reviewed the plans. She argued that no one could predict every outcome. She argued that the board acted in good faith. Some of those statements were probably true. The problem was that nobody trusted them anymore. Trust had become the real casualty. As the meeting continued, something even more interesting happened. Board members started distancing themselves from the decisions, subtly at first, then openly. One member emphasized that engineering recommendations came from consultants. Another pointed out that construction oversight involved multiple parties. A third repeatedly reminded the audience that project decisions required group approval. Nobody wanted ownership of the disaster. The unity that once defined the board was disappearing in real time. Panic does strange things to people, especially when responsibility becomes expensive. By the end of the evening, homeowners were not just questioning Vanessa. They were questioning the entire leadership structure. Calls for resignations started spreading through the room. Several residents demanded an independent audit. Others proposed removing current board leadership altogether. The momentum was unmistakable. Power was shifting. Vanessa could feel it. Everyone could. The meeting finally ended after nearly 3 exhausting hours. Residents left in groups, continuing conversations in parking lots and along sidewalks. Nobody seemed satisfied. The questions still outnumbered the answers. I was gathering my notes when Derek approached. He looked unusually serious. Without saying much, he handed me a printed packet. "What is this?" I asked. "Something a homeowner forwarded to me." I opened the first page, then the second. My eyes immediately locked onto the subject lines. Email chains, board communications, internal discussions, not meeting summaries, not public records, private conversations. I looked back at Derek. "Are these real?" He nodded. "If they are," he said quietly, "this whole thing just got worse." Because buried inside those emails might be the one thing more damaging than a warning report. Proof of what people knew after reading it. The emails answered questions the reports could not. Engineering reports showed what people were told. The emails showed what people knew. I spent most of the next day reviewing the packet Derek had given me. The messages covered several months and involved board members, consultants, project managers, and contractors. At first, nothing seemed extraordinary. Construction schedules, budget discussions, routine project updates. Then I reached the messages discussing drainage modifications. That is where everything changed. One email summarized concerns raised by a consultant regarding stormwater behavior near the flood channel. The language was professional and measured, but the warning was clear. Certain drainage features should remain in place. Additional protections were recommended. Removing them would increase risk during severe rainfall events. The message was not hidden. It was not ambiguous, it was direct. More importantly, people responded to it. That was the critical detail. Nobody could claim they never saw the warning. The email chain proved otherwise. Several board members acknowledged receiving the information. Questions were asked. Alternatives were discussed. Cost estimates were requested. The concerns were real. And everyone involved knew they were real. A few messages later, the conversation shifted. Not toward safety, toward expenses. Maintaining the drainage protections would require additional grading work. Construction timelines could be affected. Costs would increase. The discussion quickly became financial. Page after page focused on budgets, savings, project efficiency, return on investment. The risks never disappeared. They simply lost the argument. One particular message stood out from the rest. It came from Vanessa. The email was not dramatic. In fact, it was surprisingly ordinary. That made it more damaging. She acknowledged the consultant's concerns. She acknowledged the additional protections being recommended. Then she questioned whether the extra expense was justified given the project's goals and budget targets. The wording was careful, professional, measured. But the meaning was obvious. Cost had become the priority. The recommendation was not adopted. I read the email several times. Not because it contained a confession, because it documented a decision. A decision made long before the storm arrived. Long before the cabins shifted. Long before homeowners started demanding answers. The project did not fail because nobody recognized the risks. The project failed after the risks were recognized. That distinction changed everything. As copies of the emails spread among residents, the remaining support for Vanessa evaporated. People who had defended the board stopped defending it. People who blamed the weather stopped blaming it. The conversation shifted entirely. Focus was no longer on what happened during the storm. It was on what happened before it. By the end of the week, attorneys began appearing. Some represented homeowners. Others represented insurance companies. Several represented parties connected to the construction project itself. Meetings were scheduled. Documents were requested. Preservation notices were issued. The language of the dispute changed overnight. From explanations to liability. From accountability to legal exposure. The flood had damaged the cabins. The emails damaged everything else. And as lawyers started gathering records, interviewing witnesses, and reviewing the same documents I had spent months collecting, it became clear that the next phase of the story would no longer be fought in HOA meetings. It would be fought through legal action. The legal process moved much slower than the floodwater, but eventually it arrived at the same destination: responsibility. Over the following months, multiple claims were filed. Homeowners sought compensation for losses connected to the failed project. Insurance companies launched their own investigations. Contractors hired attorneys. Consultants protected themselves with documentation. Everyone involved wanted answers. More importantly, everyone wanted someone else to pay. The engineering reports, construction records, meeting minutes, photographs, and emails became part of a growing collection of evidence. Every document seemed to point toward the same conclusion. The disaster was not caused by a single decision. It was caused by a series of decisions. Each one made the project slightly more vulnerable, until the storm finally exposed all of them at once. Insurance became a major problem. Several claims were disputed. Questions emerged regarding compliance with approved plans. Investigators examined whether changes made during construction affected coverage. The process dragged on for months. Meanwhile, the damaged cabins sat mostly unused. Temporary repairs kept them standing. But nobody wanted to invest serious money into a project surrounded by uncertainty. The dream of a luxury retreat community disappeared quickly. Reservations were cancelled. Expansion plans vanished. Marketing efforts stopped. The cabins that were supposed to generate revenue became a source of expense instead. Eventually, settlement agreements were reached. The exact details remained private. Most of those agreements always do. What mattered was the outcome. Money changed hands. Claims were resolved. And the project that once promised growth became an expensive lesson. The political consequences arrived as well. Pressure from residents continued building until the HOA leadership could no longer ignore it. Special elections were discussed. Board positions were challenged. Calls for change became impossible to avoid. Vanessa fought to keep her position. For a while, it seemed she might succeed. But trust, once lost, is difficult to recover, especially when documents keep proving people right. By the end of the year, she was no longer HOA president. The vote was not close. The community had made its decision. The project survived. Her leadership did not. Life eventually returned to normal. The lawsuits faded. The meetings became less crowded. The arguments grew quieter. But every time someone drove past the cabins, they remembered what happened. And why. Several months later, after most of the headlines disappeared, I found myself returning to the flood channel on a calm afternoon. The storm was gone. The controversy was mostly over. The valley was quiet again. But I wanted to see what remained. Several months after the storm, the valley looked different. Not because of the damage. Because of the repairs. The first thing I noticed was the overflow basin. It was back. Not exactly the way it had been before, but close. Engineers had redesigned portions of the area and construction crews had restored the depression that once helped manage excess water during major storms. Fresh vegetation covered parts of the basin. New erosion controls lined sections of the drainage route. Most importantly, the land was working the way it was supposed to work. I walked along the edge of the flood channel for nearly an hour. The water level was low. The current was calm. Nothing about the scene suggested the chaos that had unfolded there months earlier. That was the strange thing about nature. It does not hold grudges. It simply keeps doing what it has always done. The channel flowed through the valley exactly as it had before the cabins were built. The restored overflow basin waited quietly beside it. The repaired landscape blended into the surrounding terrain so naturally that someone visiting for the first time might never realize a disaster had happened there. But I remembered. And so did everyone else. The cabins still stood farther up the valley. Repaired. Modified. more heavily protected than before. Expensive lessons tend to produce expensive corrections. I stopped near the edge of the restored basin and looked across the property one final time. For months, people argued about permits, engineering decisions, budgets, responsibilities, and blame. In the end, the most important lesson was much simpler. Water does not negotiate. It does not care about projections. It does not care about marketing brochures. It does not care how confident people are. And it certainly does not care how expensive their plans might be. It only follows the path the land gives it. The HOA learned that lesson the hard way. Vanessa learned it the hard way. A lot of people did. As for me, I stood there listening to the quiet flow of water moving through the channel and felt something I had not felt in a long time. Relief. The valley was finally doing what it was supposed to do. And the lesson left behind was one nobody in that community would ever forget. Water does not care how expensive your plans are. It only cares where it has always intended to go.